Tonight on Untold Sports TV, we reveal the story of a man whose greatest battle wasn't for a title, but for his freedom, a fight for justice.
The night was quiet in Paterson, New Jersey, the kind of quiet that makes you forget the world can change in an instant. It was June 17, 1966, and the clock had just passed 2:30 in the morning when the silence shattered. Inside the Lafayette bar, ordinary people were living their last ordinary moments. A bartender wiping down glasses, patrons nursing their final drinks before heading home. Then came the gunshots, sudden, violent, merciless. Two men burst through the door with shotguns and pistols, and within seconds, 4 people were bleeding on the floor while the killers vanished into the darkness like ghosts. By the time police arrived, 3 souls had already left this world, and a 4th was dying. The investigation began immediately, but for 4 agonizing months, the case went nowhere. No suspects, no leads, just mounting pressure from a city demanding justice. Then in October, 2 men were arrested. One of them was Rubin Carter, a name that echoed through boxing arenas across America. They called him Hurricane for the devastating speed of his combinations, for the fury he unleashed in the ring. He was a rising star, a contender for the world championship, a man whose fists had carried him from the depths of poverty to the threshold of glory. But now those same fists were in handcuffs, and the charges were unthinkable: triple murder. From his cell, Carter screamed the words that would become his mantra for the next 2 decades. "I'm innocent. This is a setup." But in 1960s America, a black man's protestations of innocence carried little weight against a system that had already decided his fate. 2 trials would follow. 20 years would be stolen. A career would be destroyed. A life shattered. But Rubin Hurricane Carter would never surrender, never break, never stop fighting. Because his battle wasn't just for his own freedom, it was against the entire machinery of injustice itself. This is his story, a story of rage and redemption, of systematic racism and the unbreakable human spirit, of one man's war against a system designed to crush him. Rubin Carter entered this world on May 6, 1937, in Clifton, New Jersey, a world that had already decided what a black child born into poverty could and couldn't become. His father, Lloyd, worked backbreaking hours in a factory for wages that barely kept the family afloat, while his mother, Bertha, struggled to raise 7 children in a home where hunger was a constant visitor and hope was a rare luxury. Young Rubin's childhood unfolded in the suffocating confines of the ghetto, where he witnessed daily the brutal machinery of systemic oppression. He watched white police officers beat black men in the streets with impunity, saw how the law worked differently depending on the color of your skin, felt the crushing weight of a society that viewed him not as a child with potential, but as a problem to be contained. The rage that would later define him both in and out of the ring began growing in his soul like a wildfire, deep, righteous, and increasingly dangerous. He was only 11 years old when the system first swallowed him whole. The crime? He had attacked a man who attempted to rape his friend. In Rubin's mind, this was justice, protection, doing what was right. But the system saw something entirely different: a black boy who had dared to strike a white man. The punishment was swift and merciless. He was sentenced to Jamesburg State Home for Boys, a juvenile reformatory that was less about reform and more about breaking spirits. Jamesburg was a house of horrors where beatings were routine, humiliation was policy, and guard cruelty was the primary lesson taught. Young Rubin tried to escape multiple times. Each attempt met with brutal punishment. They would throw him into solitary confinement, a dark, suffocating hole where days blurred into an endless nightmare of isolation. By the time he turned 14, he was still trapped there, his body battered, but his spirit somehow not yet destroyed. Then he discovered the gym, an old, forgotten space with a boxing ring, a heavy bag, and worn gloves that smelled of sweat and broken dreams. The moment Rubin put on those gloves and drove his fist into that bag, something fundamental shifted inside him. All the rage, all the pain, all the accumulated injustice of his young life found a channel, a purpose, a weapon. A trainer saw what others had missed. Beneath the anger was raw talent, natural speed, devastating power. Boxing became more than a sport for Rubin. It became salvation, the only place where violence was not only permitted but celebrated, where the fury that society wanted to suppress could transform into art and victory. When he was finally released at 17 in 1954, freedom lasted only long enough for another street fight, another arrest, another confrontation with the law. This time the court offered a choice: prison or military service. Rubin chose the army, serving from 1954 to 1956 in Germany, where he continued boxing in army tournaments, racking up victories and gaining recognition. But military discipline and Rubin Carter were never meant to coexist peacefully. Conflicts with commanders and repeated insubordination led to an early discharge. He returned to New Jersey at 19 years old with no education, no job prospects, no legitimate path forward. Just his fists and an unshakable determination to prove that he was more than what the world had decided he could be. In 1961, he stepped into the ring for his first professional fight and demolished his opponent with a first-round knockout. Over the next 2 years, he was nothing short of spectacular. 21 fights, 19 victories, 17 by knockout. His style wasn't just aggressive, it was apocalyptic. He didn't box, he destroyed. Every opponent became a stand-in for the system that had tried to break him, for every injustice he had suffered, for every authority figure who had ever told him he was nothing. The press started calling him Hurricane, and the name stuck like thunder to lightning. It captured perfectly the devastating combinations he unleashed, the fury he brought to every fight. By 1963, after demolishing top contender Florentino Fernandez with a first-round technical knockout, Rubin Hurricane Carter became an official world title contender. In December 1964, he got his shot at glory, 15 brutal rounds against champion Joey Jardello for the middleweight championship of the world. Carter believed he won that fight, and many observers agreed, but the judges saw it differently. The decision went to Jardello, and Carter tasted the bitter disappointment of what he considered robbery. But he didn't quit. He never quit. He kept fighting, kept winning, kept clawing his way back toward the title. By 1966, life was finally beginning to work. He bought a house, married, became a father to a beautiful daughter. He trained relentlessly, his focus laser sharp, the rematch for the championship tantalizingly close. Then came June 17, 1966, the night that would change absolutely everything. Rubin Carter spent that evening at the Night Spot Club, unwinding with friends after another grueling day of training. There was laughter, drinks, the easy camaraderie of a man who had finally found some measure of peace. Around 2 in the morning, he and his friend John Artis got into Carter's car and headed home, completely unaware that their lives were about to intersect with a tragedy they had no part in. At precisely the same moment, across town at the Lafayette Grill Bar, 2 black men entered with weapons drawn and opened fire without warning or mercy. The bartender, James Oliver, died instantly. Patron Fred Naujoks suffered a mortal wound that would claim his life a month later. William Marins and Hazel Tanis were left critically wounded, fighting for survival. Then the shooters disappeared into the night in a white Dodge, leaving behind carnage and a city desperate for answers. Minutes later, a patrol car spotted a white Dodge just blocks from the crime scene. Behind the wheel sat Rubin Carter, with John Artis in the passenger seat. The officers conducted a search, looking for weapons, finding nothing. They let them go and continued their hunt for the real killers. But as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the investigation stalled completely. The police had no suspects, no solid leads, just mounting pressure from a terrified public and a mayor demanding results. 4 months of dead ends had left them desperate, and desperate police are dangerous police. In October 1966, they caught their break, or so they thought. 2 small-time criminals named Alfred Bello and Arthur Bradley were arrested for burglary, and during interrogation, they saw an opportunity to trade their way out of trouble. They offered the police exactly what they needed: testimony placing Rubin Carter and John Artis at the Lafayette bar that night, leaving with weapons in hand. It was a lie, a complete, calculated fabrication. But the police didn't care about verification or truth. They cared about closing a case that had made them look incompetent for months. And Carter was the perfect suspect. Black, aggressive, with a criminal record, and famous enough that his arrest would make headlines and satisfy the public's hunger for justice. On October 19, 1966, police arrested Rubin Carter and charged him with triple murder. He screamed his innocence, demanded his lawyer, insisted he had an alibi. Nobody was listening. His face appeared on newspaper front pages across the country. Boxer Hurricane arrested for murder. In an instant, his career evaporated. Contracts were canceled, sponsors fled. The boxing world that had celebrated him now pretended he had never existed. His defense attorney worked frantically to build a case for innocence. There were witnesses who had seen Carter at the club during the murders. The timeline didn't match. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no gunpowder residue, nothing. But the prosecution had what they needed: the testimony of Bello and Bradley, two criminals willing to swear under oath that they saw what the police needed them to see. When the trial began in May 1967, the battle lines were clear and deeply familiar. A black defendant facing an all-white jury in an America convulsing with racial violence. Prosecutor Vincent Hull building his entire case on the words of admitted criminals while the defense desperately pointed to the absence of any actual evidence. The verdict came down like a guillotine. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was 3 consecutive life terms. Rubin Carter, 29 years old, a man who had been on the verge of becoming world champion, was led away in chains to Trenton State Prison, maximum security. As that steel door clanged shut behind him, and he sat alone in his 5-by-8-foot cell, Rubin Carter faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Accept this injustice and die slowly in that cage, or fight with every breath he had left, knowing the fight might never end. He chose to fight. Trenton Prison became Rubin Carter's world, a brutal concrete universe where he was confined 23 hours a day in a cell barely larger than a coffin stood on end, with 1 hour of yard time his only glimpse of sky. But if the system thought imprisonment would break him, they fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. Carter launched a war, not with his fists this time, but with something far more dangerous: his absolute refusal to be defined by their rules. He refused to wear the prison uniform, insisting on his own clothes. He refused to work the prison jobs designed to keep inmates compliant. He refused to bow, to submit, to acknowledge the legitimacy of his captivity. For this defiance, he was beaten, thrown into solitary confinement, punished in ways designed to crush the human spirit. But each punishment seemed only to make him stronger, more resolved, more certain that his resistance mattered. He began reading with an intensity that bordered on obsession, devouring books on law, philosophy, history. Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Frantz Fanon. He was giving himself the education the world had denied him, transforming himself from a fighter who used his fists into an intellectual warrior who could use words and ideas as weapons. Boxing had made him strong, but prison was making him brilliant. Then in 1974 came a development that should have changed everything. Alfred Bello and Arthur Bradley, the prosecution's star witnesses, recanted their testimony. They confessed that they had lied under oath, that police had coerced them with promises of freedom and money, that their entire testimony had been a fabrication designed to close an embarrassing case. The foundation of the prosecution crumbled. Carter's lawyers filed appeals, and in 1975, an appeals court agreed that the conviction was tainted. The verdict was overturned, and after 9 years behind bars, Rubin Carter walked out of Trenton's gates as a free man, at least temporarily. But the prosecution refused to let go. They found new witnesses, constructed new theories, and demanded a retrial. In 1976, Carter found himself back in court, facing the same charges, the same flimsy evidence, but this time with a new prosecution theory: racial revenge. They claimed without any supporting evidence that Carter had murdered white people in retaliation for the killing of a black bar owner earlier that night. It was absurd, illogical, and completely unsupported by facts. But the jury was once again all white, and this was still America. The verdict came down exactly as before. Guilty. Rubin Carter was sent back to that same cell in Trenton, back to that same 5 by 8 foot cage, sentenced once again to 3 consecutive life terms. But something had changed during his brief taste of freedom. The world was beginning to pay attention. In 1975, music legend Bob Dylan had written a song about Carter called simply Hurricane, 8 minutes and 33 verses exposing the injustice, the racism, the fabricated evidence. When the song became a hit, millions of people heard Rubin Carter's story for the first time. Suddenly, support concerts were being held, celebrities were speaking out, money was being raised for his defense. Muhammad Ali visited him in prison, embraced him, called him brother. Activists around the world began demanding justice. But despite the growing movement, appeals continued to be rejected year after year. 1977, 1978, 1979, 1980. Carter remained in his cell, reading, writing, fighting with words instead of fists. He wrote his autobiography, The 16th Round, which became a bestseller and spread his story even further. The years in prison were taking their toll. He lost teeth from poor nutrition, his eyesight deteriorated, his body aged prematurely. But the one thing that never weakened was his spirit, his absolute certainty of his innocence, his refusal to confess to crimes he didn't commit even if it might have earned him parole. In 1980, a group of young Canadians read his book and believed. Lesra Martin, along with his adoptive family Sam and Terry Chayton, decided to dedicate themselves to freeing an innocent man. They hired new lawyers, private investigators, and began researching the case from the ground up, uncovering evidence the original defense had missed, finding contradictions in prosecution testimony, discovering documents that police had conveniently hidden. By 1985, they had built an ironclad case, and federal judge Haddon Lee Sorokin agreed to review the conviction. The evidence was damning. Police had suppressed witness statements that contradicted their narrative. Gunpowder tests had come back a negative, proving Carter never fired a weapon. Prosecution witnesses were revealed to be paid police informants, and the entire racial revenge motive was exposed as a prosecution fantasy with no basis in reality. On November 8, 1985, Judge Sorokin issued his ruling. The conviction was based on racism and violated constitutional rights. It was overturned. After 19 years behind bars, Rubin Carter walked out of Trenton Prison a free man at age 48, his hair gray, his body worn, but his spirit undefeated. Journalists surrounded him immediately, shouting questions about anger, revenge, bitterness. Everyone expected rage from a man who had lost nearly 2 decades to a lie. Instead, Carter looked directly into the cameras and spoke words that would define his legacy. "I'm not angry. Hatred would have destroyed me far more than prison ever could. I chose love instead, and now I am truly free." Freedom, Carter discovered, was more complicated than simply walking out of prison gates. What does a man do when the system has stolen 20 years of his life? The years when he should have been raising his daughter, building his career, living the dreams he'd fought so hard to achieve? How does someone reconstruct a life from ruins? Carter made a decision that surprised many. He moved to Canada, to Toronto, to live with the Chayton family who had fought so hard to free him. It was a new country, a fresh start, a chance to build something entirely different from what had been taken from him. He didn't return to boxing. His body was too damaged. Too many years had passed. That door had closed forever. But he discovered a new mission that was perhaps even more important, dedicating his life to fighting for other innocent people, trapped in the same nightmare he had endured. Carter became a powerful activist, speaking at universities, conferences, and prisons around the world, telling his story not to seek pity, but to demand systemic change. He helped establish the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, working alongside lawyers and investigators to re-examine cases, uncover hidden evidence, and fight for the release of innocent prisoners. Through his tireless work, dozens of people walked free from unjust imprisonment, lives saved, families reunited, justice slowly, painfully achieved. In 1993, the state of New Jersey finally paid him compensation for his wrongful imprisonment, though no amount of money could return the stolen years, restore his health, or give him back the time he should have spent watching his daughter grow up. Then in 1999, Hollywood told his story in a film called The Hurricane, with Denzel Washington delivering an Oscar-nominated performance as Carter. The film brought his story to millions more people, sparked a new wave of attention to wrongful convictions, and helped push through reforms that would make such miscarriages of justice slightly less likely in the future. Carter consulted on the film, worked closely with Washington, and attended the glamorous premiere. But for him, it was never about Hollywood recognition or personal vindication. It was about ensuring that the world understood how the system could fail, how innocent people could suffer, and why we all have a responsibility to demand better. He married Lisa Peters, one of the women who had helped secure his freedom, and they built a quiet, peaceful life together in Toronto. But the fight never truly ended for Carter. He continued speaking, writing, helping others until the very end. In 2011, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. He fought the disease with the same determination he had brought to every other battle in his life, enduring treatments and surgeries without complaint. But on April 20th, 2014, the fight finally ended. Rubin "Hurricane" Carter died in Toronto at the age of 76. The news of his death spread around the world. Bob Dylan released a statement. Denzel Washington expressed his condolences. Muhammad Ali, himself gravely ill by then, sent words of remembrance. The funeral was quiet, attended by family, close friends, and activists who understood that they were saying goodbye not just to a man, but to a symbol of resistance, resilience, and redemption. He was buried in Toronto, the city that had given him refuge and peace. On his headstone are simple words: Rubin "Hurricane" Carter, fighter to the end. Rubin Carter's story is a mirror held up to America, reflecting truths we'd rather not see. In 1966, an all-white jury convicted a black man with zero physical evidence. Just two liars who later confessed they'd been coerced. Research shows this wasn't unusual. African Americans are 6 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted. Carter wasn't an exception. He was the rule. 19 years in a cage. The system offered deals. Confess for freedom. He refused. Chose 2 decades in prison over 1 day as a liar. That's not stubbornness. That's unbreakable dignity. He didn't free himself. Bob Dylan wrote a song. A Canadian family believed. Lawyers worked for free. Activists refused to forget. One person can't change a corrupt system, but a movement can. The cost? His boxing career, his youth, his health, years with his daughter, time that can never return. And he was just one. Since 1989, over 375 people exonerated by DNA evidence. Average imprisonment, 14 years. How many more are screaming right now unheard? After release, Carter chose forgiveness, not for them, but for himself. Hatred would have destroyed me more than prison. He understood. Hatred is its own cage, destroying you from within. Real freedom is spiritual, the ability to choose love over hate. 60 years later, the fight continues. The system remains imperfect, still destroying innocent lives. Right now, someone sits in a cell, screaming innocence to a system that won't listen. Carter called it the 16th round. Life itself, the fight beyond the ring. He fought his for 76 years, didn't win the championship, but won something greater. His soul, his dignity, his humanity. His lesson: systems can be unjust, but we must not be. Life can be cruel, but we must not be. Choose love, because who you remained defines whether you truly won. Rubin Carter remained human until his last breath. That's how he won. The 16th round continues. How will you fight it? If you found this story interesting, we've prepared something even more intriguing for you in our upcoming release on Untold Sports TV. You can expect an even more captivating plot filled with details that will give you a fresh perspective on familiar sporting events. It's definitely a story you won't want to miss. Join the community, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Hit the like button if you enjoyed this video. Leave a comment below. We value your feedback and love discussing these stories with you. See you in the next video.